Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the fifth chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being of Bodily Exertion in War. The text follows. If no one were allowed to pass an opinion on the events of war, except at a moment when he is benumbed by frost, sinking from heat and thirst, or dying with hunger and fatigue, we should certainly have fewer judgments correct objectively, but they would be so subjectively at least. That is, they would contain in themselves the exact relation between the person giving the judgment and the object. We can perceive this by observing how modestly subdued, even spiritless and desponding, is the opinion passed upon the results of the untoward events by those who have been eye-witnesses, but especially if they have been parties concerned. This is, according to our view, a criterion of the influence which bodily fatigue exercises, and of the allowance to be made for it in matters of opinion. Amongst the many things in war for which no tariff can be fixed, bodily effort may be specially reckoned. Provided there is no waste, it is a coefficient of all the forces, and no one can tell exactly to what extent it may be carried. But what is remarkable is that just as only a strong arm enables the archer to stretch the bowstring to the utmost extent, so also in war it is only by means of a great directing spirit that we can expect the full power latent in the troops to be developed. For it is one thing if an army, in consequence of great misfortunes, surrounded with danger, falls all to pieces, like a wall that has been thrown down, and can only find safety in the utmost exertion of its bodily strength. It is another thing entirely when a victorious army, drawn on by proud feelings only, is conducted at the will of its chief. The same effort which in the one case might at most excite our pity must in the other call forth our admiration, because it is much more difficult to sustain. By this comes to light for the inexperienced eye one of those things which put fetters in the dark, as it were, on the action of the mind, and wear out in secret the powers of the soul. Although here the question is strictly only respecting the extreme effort required by a commander from his army, by a leader from his followers, therefore of the spirit to demand it and of the art of getting it, still the personal physical exertion of generals and of the chief commander must not be overlooked. Having brought the analysis of war conscientiously up to this point, we could not but take account also of the weight of this small remaining residue. We have spoken here of bodily effort, chiefly because, like danger, it belongs to the fundamental causes of friction, and because its indefinite quantity makes it like an elastic body, the friction of which is well known not to be difficult to calculate. To check the abuse of these considerations, of such a survey of things which aggravate the difficulties of war, nature has given our judgment a guide in our sensibilities, just as an individual cannot with advantage refer to his personal deficiencies if he is insulted and ill-treated, but may well do so if he has successfully repelled the affront, or has fully revenged it, so no commander will lessen the impression of a disgraceful defeat by depicting the danger, the distress, the exertions, things which would immensely enhance the glory of a victory. Thus our feeling, which after all is only a higher kind of judgment, forbids us to do what seems an act of justice, to which our judgment would be inclined. So, very interesting chapter that deals with the subjective and objective side of bodily exertion in war. That is particularly important to bear in mind every time we make a military analysis. We try to understand something about war and the current conditions. So, von Clausewitz starts by saying, if no one were allowed to pass an opinion on the events of war, except at a moment when he is benumbed by frost, sinking from heat and thirst, or dying with hunger and fatigue, we should certainly have fewer judgments correct objectively. So this is particularly important as a statement, first of all, because it's really the opposite of what is often, what war is often portrayed like. Here von Clausewitz is basically saying, if we were really to stress the subjective perspective of who is suffering in war, we would basically get not a better judgment of war, but a way less one, because at that point that person would be in fact strained by this terrible sufferance and would not be able to assess lots of other things. By the way, this is particularly important for combat proper as well, understanding the decrease of, for example, combat effectiveness or general awareness, and understanding that, as we have seen in war, is actually the most important element before then emotions, etc. But this also has to do with emotions, because naturally the bodily exertion brings into play also our will to continue being under that exertion, for example. So you, as any person who suffers in some reason, knows you tend to continuing with what is fundamentally making you suffer, going against your own will at one point, say give up fundamentally, and this is what we all tend to do under a certain amount of stress. But this Clausewitzian phrase, in my opinion, is dramatically important for today's popular perception of war, right? Because essentially, I think that every time we study war, we tend to portray it, or especially to a larger audience, right? In popular culture, even look at movies that tend to be kind of accurate, etc. It's always about this cliche about the person essentially suffering. I mean, it's not really reflect about it. You might say, well, what should it be about? Well, if you wonder that, you're falling into the cliche in itself, right? Because it's extremely rare to find a war movie, for example, that actually portrays what it is really, a military operation in its true function, and aside from the timid romantic guy that is thrown out there and so shocked and scared, right? You don't find movies, for example, on military operations. You just find about movies about showing the first, let's say the eye account, fundamentally very emotional, very sensitive, and I say that this is, in my opinion, a wrong approach. I mean, we obviously you can have terrific artistic results by representing something like that, but if this has to make for a broader generalized awareness about what war is really about, is really taking aside the emotionalistic, the tribalistic side of the story that is essentially also what in our world largely war is not really about. So I stress this point a lot, because as long as we going on thinking that war is just sufferance and nothing else, we can't understand what war is in the first place, because you basically look at the consequences, not at the causes, but not even at the dynamics proper, if not in a narrow sense. And we need this emotionalistic approach, and even still today, because of many reasons. First of all, shock emotions, shock effects are kind of always effective, right? We tend to be attracted by them instinctively. So it pays to invest on that when you try to portray war. Secondly, even if you're not really aware of that, there is this strong influence of, let's say, anti-war, you can say policy, but it's much broader, like it's a broader cultural phenomenon that in some ways has been part, albeit in very different ways, of the very, in my opinion, dishonest critic to von Clausewitz himself, both from the pacifistic side, that is naturally something pretty extreme and radical in its conceptions, and nevertheless very dangerous, but also from the culturalist side of the story that does stress the fact that essentially war, which is false by the way, is fundamentally dictated by subjectivism, right? Von Clausewitz in the Vom Kriege is the most clear manifesto and demonstration that nobody has ever been able to even remotely overcome, that war is not dictated by subjective factors as a phenomenon, right? As a phenomenon of war in its objective sense. War is objective. It's something that is inherent to our human potential, right? And it's deeply rooted in our aggressiveness, in our primordial feelings, etc. It has to do with that, because theoretically, war is not something you should be using, as if it was just something else. It's something dreadful, something really terrible, can really make you suffer in a way you can't even imagine objectively. But the Clausewitzian theory simply tells you that doesn't matter how you can pretend to stop conflict in our world, there will always be conflict. And this is not a cultural statement. This is, if you want, a scientific statement. It's a biological, anthropological statement that goes beyond what subjective opinions are. And this is what von Clausewitz is now presenting us with. It's making us understand that if you really want to understand the war, you have to not to abstract from sufferings and subjectivity. You have to take them in very strict account, because that has to do, for example, in many cases, with how the outcome is really of war is really happening. But there is a whole world behind that, beyond that, above that, I would even better say. That is by far the most important aspect of the story. That is to say, we shouldn't care about the subjective side. Not really. In fact, von Clausewitz says, and in order to conclude this phrase, he is basically saying, and this is very important, do not trust people who pretend to tell you what war is on a subjective base, right? Do not pretend that a person that has been scarred by war, has been traumatized by war, has been, destroyed, even inwardly, by war, is able to give you a correct judgment about what war is. Because in order to understand what war is, believe it or not, you have to study and to use reason, not to use feelings. And that's the trap in which they will make you fall continuously, right? Because it buys, it's very effective, actually, to stress the emotionalistic side of the story to impress people. But it turns out that in order to understand just how a battle works or a war works, you take a whole lifetime of studying. Otherwise, you can't understand a freaking damn thing about it, right? And if you start from the principle that a war shouldn't be done in the first place, you basically become defenseless in the eventuality that it is quite likely that you will be part, that you are actually already part of how wars are fought. Because believe it or not, even if you're an isolationist and you want to have nothing to do with that, you still provoke consequences in this or that direction, and people are going to exploit that. So never think that you're out, that you're in your bubble, let's say, and that if you don't do anything, you just stay there with your iPhone and spending your whole day on Facebook. That is an effective way to say, I've never harmed anyone. Because actually, it's not all about what you do, but it's also what you do not do that makes a difference, politically speaking. Every single action that you make has political consequences, whether you intended them or not. And von Clausewitz, always remember, he's writing this book because in the eventuality that, as sadly we know, from the 19th century would occur, that, your own people, your own family, whoever you care about, will be involved in a war. And therefore, even, the Vom Kriege should be seen essentially as a sort of vaccine, in a certain sense, towards the naivety of emotionalistic and subjectivistic approaches to war, right? That do nothing but harm, because a person who doesn't understand war is not able to defend himself in the case he can happen to be involved into one. And always remember this. And there is when we talk about strategic culture on Schwerpunkt, we're really talking about civic education and democratic culture, right? If you don't know anything about war, you can't be a democratic person. You can't be a citizen, really. You can be a subject or a like a tribal warrior, something like that, but not a thinking being, not someone who can deal with the radically, let's say, developed and sophisticated and reactive dimension that war really is in every society above the individual, right? Von Clausewitz, however, and this is really the genius of the person, because it makes you understand the things here in so in depth, right? Already reading this first phrase would make half of the world, if they listen to this, kind of maybe, I don't know, maybe not freaking out, but let's say saying what, being confused, because who does really explain these things out there? And it's a fairly simple concept. I mean, it doesn't take here to have even, to have who knows which competence, even if I hadn't read anything of this before, it's something I could simply state, right? And it's very easy to understand. However, von Clausewitz, and that's here how refined he is, states, but such judgments, right, that wouldn't be correct objectively, would be correct, although subjectively at least, right? What does this mean? It means that basically they would contain in themselves the exact relation between the person giving the judgment and the object, right? So coming on what we were saying before, it means, okay, you can't get an objective judgment by a person who is under mortar shells, right? And shelling, and you however need to know, if you want to study that situation, what the judgment of that person in that moment is, because that person, whether it's a combatant, hopefully maybe not a civilian, in that moment is behaving in a way, he's judging the situation in a way that is exactly, let's say, and probably way more closer to objectivity than you are relatively to telling that story. This is particularly important, right? Because it's obvious that the soldier, when he's about to, it's risking to die, can say, okay, I don't care about the cause of this war, I just want to save my own skin, right? It's somewhat normal in many chances. Actually, war is a bit deeper than that. There are many motives for which people fight, also the brotherhood, the esprit de corps, let's say, also and definitely patriotism and other virtues, or even fanatism, because that can happen as well, some sort of belief. But that is equally important, because I presume when you're under really a bombardment, you can, and this is what von Clausewitz actually explained already, emotions take over, right? And we can see this actually from everything we know from combat. Like even the most hyper-trained special combat, let's say special forces fighter with years of experience ahead, if he is put under certain conditions of stress, can definitely lose his mind, start using his, assault rifle like a club instead than a rifle, and this is the normality of human hardware. Like we are apes, nothing else. So we work in that way, and we can. And discipline and training are definitely aimed at making. First of all, it's selecting, by the way, because not everybody is really fit for doing certain things, as we know. Not even in the case of special forces. But at the same time, It's also aimed at building a bit more confidence and and cooling blood a little bit, right? So that the trooper can respond to this extreme stimulations from the external that should not make him lose his mind. But we all have a breaking point, right? It's perfectly known. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, we can perceive this by observing how modestly subdued, even spiritless and desponding, is the opinion passed upon the results of an untoward events by those who have been eyewitnesses, but especially if they have been parties concerned. Right? So this can really be observed at any point in some measure, right? That you naturally understand that all of our knowledge passes through a degree of subjectivity, right? If you really want to make it a scientific or philosophical point, that's really it. I mean, none of us really understands fully what the hell is going on at any moment, right? But this is this kind of objective and subjective dimension is to be always present into our mind if we want to understand the war, because we should be as objective as we can for ourselves, and part of this objectivity is also aimed at understanding the subjectivity of people who are involved into war, right? And von Clausewitz says, this is according to our view a criterion of the influence which bodily fatigue exercises, and of the allowance to be made for it in matters of opinion, right? So what I would like people to be aware about is that having participated to an action, military action, doesn't mean to understand, first of all, that action, nor war. You say, oh well, no, because look at veterans, they know all better. No, actually they don't. I mean, if you don't really have a further understanding of the situation, that maybe the person that participates there can be the highest one ever. I'm not saying that we can't understand what that really is, and that's what also von Clausewitz is talking about. He is saying, we cannot know. Here, von Clausewitz is a person who has witnessed these things on his own skin. So he's not really criticizing people who have gone through such things because of the situation, but it's exactly because of such things that these people are more aware of what those bodily exertions, broadly meant, actually mean. Secondly, at the same time, you exactly when you are into that trouble, chances are that you tend to lose a real understanding of what is going on. And you can see this from military history all the time. Like, do you think that we actually know military history? That when you study a map, let's say, or a battle, or from a book, you are actually studying real history. I mean, sometimes on my channel, when I make videos about battles or wars, I often state, we don't really know. These are just hypotheses. It's a reconstruction that can be better or worse, etc. It always arrived, the average no one that says, things went that way. Because why? First of all, maybe you can listen to the video and realizing that my whole point is about the difficulty of explaining something that ultimately nobody knows. Then the freshman arrives and says, well, I know everything, how it's gone. It's gone that way, you know everything. You were there probably. But not even if that person had been there would know it. So I know that it sounds somehow, to some at least, it can sound challenging or controversial, and I realize it's, let's say, a rhetorical instrument in some way to say, okay, well, that you can't dismiss even the opinion of some authority on the field. Well, you should always be able to remain humble anyway, from both sides, in the sense that, for example, I've met people who have been into war actually, as I've met military men in general, military men who were sometimes military historians and professors at universities. I've met civilian military historians, which I am, by the way, even though I had a very brief experience in military experience myself, but what you can see through the spectrum that is I give you is fairly rare to get, because already for many people, I guess it's fascinating in first place to meet certain people like these, or to talk with them, or having the chance of that. We can't even try. I don't know where Schwerpunkt would lead us in the future, but we may even start making interviews or something. That would be pretty interesting in my opinion. But the concept is that you can see, especially if you have a bit been in all, if you have managed to comprehend at least, or to try to understand at least all of these perspectives, that there is a dramatic problem of communicability, of comprehension, and of ultimate awareness, right? I think most of what my life has been, especially in its last part, it's been about really confronting with the reality that we all basically don't know what we are talking about. It may be weird. Obviously it's not so dramatic. I strongly believe in the fact that, as you know, the truth does exist, but the problem is actually trying to figure that out, which never occurs at the end of the day, but we can get a better, worse perception. Von Clausewitz helps us to get through this. And when you read it, if you have this kind of experiences, you start understanding what the points of certain people are, and what you realize at the end of the day is that what really creates the major problem is the subjectivity, and in part the emotionalistic side of the story, right? If you go out there for trying to say something because you have kind of emotional reasons for that, or better, emotional agendas or goals or ideologies, etc., you are automatically putting yourself, you're exposing yourself to, to be simply mistaken, right, and to be corrected as a consequence. Meaning what? That we all have this. I'm not saying I'm here because I'm perfectly neutral. Nobody's neutral, but I personally, for example, something that I would like my followers to understand is that I never, ever come here because I have a favoritism towards one side or another, right? If you look at the topics I cover, even when we talk about von Clausewitz, but also, in other, I don't care about what your political orientation is, what your spiritual orientation is, where you come from. I don't care whether, in this case, like if you talk about civilians, if we talk about military men, I don't care. I can obviously provoke thinking, knowing what certain subjective perspectives are really about, but that's what von Clausewitz is kind of trying to be aware of, make us aware of, when we say, okay, there is a subjectivity that you have to be able to understand in an objective sense, usually from the external, but also and evidently from the within, because also von Clausewitz knew these things, having spent much of his existence in war as a military man, and in a hell of wars, not just in the corner of some obscure area. He went through all the freaking wars of coalition during Napoleonic Wars on the battlefield. So the general advice is always to remain rather open to the fact that there is too much to learn, and it's kind of more convenient sometimes to listen, like that we are trying to do with von Clausewitz, rather than pretending to know everything. Like, right? It's, and you can't do it humbly, technically speaking. I think personally there is nothing humble in trying to explain something in the first place, like I pretend to be doing right now. And there's always something you can't criticize me of, but into this. But believe me, my main goal is to make people full of doubts rather than than certainties. Meaning what? That there is a direction, but you can't basically get certain about things until you don't start to understand what doubts are. Because if you don't understand what the unknown is, or what I mean that there is an unknown in the first place, or that doubts are at the base of all of our cognitive process, you can't properly even learn something. You basically repeat something that you've read somewhere and nothing else. There can't be any criticism having read like two things, because that hasn't acquainted you to the complexity of the problem, and nobody is never enough acquainted to it, right? There is no limit. As soon as you acknowledge that there is no limit, that's where the interesting things start to happen. And it's not easy sometimes, because it's very seducing to pretend to know, right? And to have this monolithic conventions, like, that's how. But whatever. I hope you got what I meant. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, amongst the many things in war for which no tariff can be fixed, bodily effort may be specially reckoned, right? Provided there is no waste, it is a coefficient of all the forces, and no one can tell exactly to what extent it may be carried, right? This is particularly interesting as a concept because, naturally, when we're talking about bodily exertion, we're, at least in this case, I believe we're talking about, really, von Clausewitz is talking about a strictly physical dimension, right? But at the same time is obviously implying that this physical dimension is constantly tied to a moral one, a spiritual one, right? So it's interesting how here he conceives the whole thing, because it's as if this bodily effort was not just an individual thing, but actually a coefficient of all the forces, provided that there is no waste, which means obviously that there is always waste, and that it's continuous, right? These are the laws of thermodynamics. You can't really elude them, and we will see now going on with following chapters, etc., how this articulates itself. Here from Clausewitz, if you heard at the beginning, is introducing also the concept of attrition. That is probably one of the most important concept in absolute terms in the whole Clausewitzian theory. I mean, not probably, but I was thinking probably not the first, let's say, but definitely one of the first. So, and there is this some sort of potential, right, that nobody can know up to which point it can be really exercised. And this is really not pertaining only the bodily effort, but also in fact the spiritual, the moral sources, resources, if you want. So that you can never know how better or how worse you can do something. So equally with physical force is a bit the same thing. And you understand that in war there is a huge physical effort. If anything for shifting means and materials and I mean men, means and material throughout the space. There's a pretty complicated thing with definitely a consumption. I mean erosion towards the throughout the whole process. Then von Clausewitz says, but what is remarkable is that just as only a strong arm enables the archer to stretch the bowstring to the utmost extent, so also in war it is only by means of a great directing spirit that we can expect the full power latent in the troops to be developed. Right? So here we get to the point that obviously bodily and spiritual elements are always intertwined, right? And you can't do anything with the bodily effort if this is not exercised by will, right? So you can have a lot of military potential. This is the concise version of the story, but basically not making it, putting it profitably at use, because fundamentally there is no interest to use it, right? And this is something that goes very, very, very deep, not just into war, but also in society and politics, right? So, and as you remember, von Clausewitz explains that the tendency of mankind is always to, grow lazier, right? Unless, until there is no new pressure intervening, you can have a lot of potential, but you can be sure that actually most of it is gonna be wasted in a way or another, right? Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, "For it is one thing if an army, in consequence of great misfortunes, surrounded with danger, falls all to pieces like a wall that has been thrown down, and can only find safety in the utmost exertion of its bodily strength. And it is another thing entirely when a victorious army, drawn on by profound feelings only, is conducted at the will of its chief," right? Excuse me, I drink a little bit before we go on. So, here, von Clausewitz highlights another very important point, that is indeed that some of the greatest bodily effort is provided in conditions of stress, as we were saying right now. So that it's very different when there is an army of rookies marching, all well equipped, in good fashion. Maybe an army that has just one is being replenished, like in this case, von Clausewitz is making the example, resupplied and has a high moral, and the one of an army, in fact, that is into dire straits, right? So this is also particularly important to bear in mind, right? Because when pressure decreases, also the overall bodily effort decreases, right? And naturally there are reactions, but usually when you can test in your life normally, when you're under pressure, you're basically all concentrating on solving the problem and saying, when I will be free from this, I will do so much better for the, to make up for the time I've lost, or let's say making in a way that I will not lose more time. But what happens is that maybe that happens for a while when the problem is solved, but then eventually you relax and you say, finally, now I just take a little break, and you grow tired, you grow lazy, and you start, losing strength, capability, and maybe you lose even more time, the one you were losing when you were trying to solve the problem, because of the problem, right? So this naturally in war happens very with pressures that are much higher than normal, and naturally with certain excesses that can bring to traumas and therefore to dysfunctions. So it's not easy, right? And it but it has to be taken into consideration. That's why morale is so important, because morale does respond elastically, let's say, to these stimulations, right? To these pressures, to these impulses. So here von Clausewitz says the same effort which in the one case might at most excite our pity must in the other call forth our admiration, because it's much more difficult to sustain, right? So it's naturally there is a difference, right? So it's not about and this has to do in fact with the subjectivity of the situation, right? There is this idea that in fact the victorious army is the glorious one. Everybody kind of likes it because they look cool. They have just won, and yeah, maybe they went through something terrible, but think at the perspective of who lost that and who got therefore near to the end at that point, at the point of losing it, of breaking, but also understanding that perspective as something which does matter and that did cause a reaction, right? That brought theoretically to the hope of making it, or at least to try to solve the problem with, not just with more bodily strength, but at that point also with more intelligence applied. And this effort, however, is putting you to the test, right? It is saying, yeah, you can afford this. You can let's say intensify this effort, but if you do it, you will also tend to lose moral resources as well as physical ones, and those are always intertwined. So that you can't have a functional army if it doesn't have the strengths, the material strengths to work, right? So that's obvious. It's one of the first things you learn when you study war in general. So, von Clausewitz then says, by this comes to light for the inexperienced eye one of those things which put feathers in the dark, as it were, on the action of the mind, and wear out in secret the powers of the soul. Then, although here the question is strictly only respecting the extreme effort required by a commander from his army, by a leader from his followers, therefore of the spirit to demand it and of the art of getting it, still the personal physical exertion of generals and of the chief commander must not be overlooked. Having brought the analysis of war conscientiously up to this point, we could not but take account also of the weight of this small remaining residue. Right, so here it's concentrating the attention on the exertion also of commanders, like those who theoretically are the most detached from actually the strictly bodily exertion. But we all know how tough it is sometimes to physically speaking, to have a responsibility as well. There are psychological problems that can come from that. So it's not easy. It's something that consumes you, even physically. So never think that a commander-in-chief is not under pressure, doesn't consume energies, is not worn out by difficulties, etc. So this is a factor that exists and that doesn't have to be overlooked. Also because the general the decisional capabilities have a lot to do with physical side of the story. For example, not sleeping, right? A commander-in-chief should always be well rested. He can't be 24-hour a day really concentrated on that. He must sleep, because we know that if you do not sleep, you're not even able to connect at that point, to make to reflect, to reason, which, as we've seen in war, is at those levels in command you need great minds in order to make things function, right? It's not really the soldier who makes the greater rational effort to solve the situations, but commanders are, hopefully for the army, by the way. And also interacting with other in the headquarters with other seconds in command, etc., is relationally conditioned by how your physical conditions are. you can be less open, for example, to suggestions, to advice, even a good one, of course, and criticism. If you are not well rested, if you don't well physically, we get nervous when we are under stress. That's normal. It's all one with physical and psychological aspects, right? So then von Clausewitz goes on, says, we have spoken here of bodily effort, chiefly because, like danger, it belongs to the fundamental causes of friction. Because it is indefinite quantity makes it like an elastic body, the friction of which is well known to be difficult to calculate, right? So, just like danger, also the bodily effort has to do with friction. And there is this very difficultly, let's say, understandable dimension of how much you can ask in terms of this effort. It can be theoretically calculated, but it swings, right? So there is definitely also an empirical dimension behind this that comes from experience, that comes from the having seen it before, right? And knowing how much you can put men under stress. And naturally, these measures are always evolving, right? Also in potential, not just in outcome. So you should be able as a commander to track this, like to understand it, and it naturally takes some knowledge of what you're commanding. That's why also what the relation between a commander and his soldiers is so important, so that you actually know your human material, right? You on whom you can rely and whom you can't. I mean, this is evident, especially in at levels in the organic, which there is a cooperation between lots of people at a company level. When you basically, when you have units like companies, in fact, that are basically structured in order to make the commander knowing basically, theoretically at least, anyone in the unit, so that he can actually pick, because he's the last commander into the hierarchy that commands from the field proper, right? So he's the one who really that has direct command over every soldier, right? So and there is always a kind of a hierarchy and interaction that emerges from there. It's not cold, right? Like it can be sometimes in the higher hierarchies. This idea of hierarchies is very important. We will have to deepen it one day. So, and it's difficult to calculate, right? This potential is always very, very difficult to calculate. Then von Clausewitz says, to check the abuse of these considerations of such a survey of things which aggravate the difficulties of war, nature has given our judgment a guide in our sensibilities. Right? So just as an individual cannot with advantage refer to his personal deficiencies if he is insulted and ill-treated, but may well do so if he has successfully repelled the affront or has fully revenged it, so no commander will lessen the impression of a disgraceful defeat by depicting the danger, the distress, the exertions, things which would immensely enhance the glory of a victory. Thus our feeling, which after all is only a higher kind of judgment, forbids us to do what seems an act of justice to which our judgment would be inclined. So von Clausewitz says, well, yeah, okay, everything is difficult in this case, but never forget that we do have some kind of sensibility towards these issues that we can definitely understand when we relate ourselves with others, right? And this comes, like, he makes this interesting parallelism, like saying, I think when the psychological attitude that you have when you succeed and when you're defeated, when you fail, there are two very different attitudes that tend to have very kind of opposite approaches to, at least instinctively, to difficulties, to exertion, right? Once you succeed into something like an exam, etc., in a competition, isn't really the first thing you have in mind the idea of leaving everything behind. Like, now you have passed, you're the winner, like you made it, you're cool, and you can't forget about all the effort, in fact, that you have made. So at that point you tend to say, well, you know what, yes, it was kind of difficult, but I made it, and all it mattered at the end was something else, and you're kind of satisfied and self-complacent by saying, it's all about the preparation, etc. But there are lots of other things that, especially when you were still under the struggle, you probably you were really extremely concerned with, right? And that the defeated will try always to concentrate more on, because if you fail instead, your natural behavior is to stress, in fact, the problem posed by danger, distress, exertions that normally would be, in fact, as Clausewitz rightfully points out here, what would immensely enhance the glory of a victory instead. So that we praise victory because it comes through strife, right? Through struggle into these difficulties that you constantly have. But in the case of the defeated, that is the person that fundamentally doesn't arrive to the end, doesn't achieve, doesn't fulfill its own tasks and or objectives, is naturally the first problem, because the failure naturally has a cost also in itself, and especially also in here, both bodily and spiritual, because at the end of the day you have consumed something, so that you can't really achieve something without losing something else. This is always very important to bear in mind. Sometimes you could even, this approach, depending on the outcome, really has to do with probably your worth count. Like, if something goes well, you tend to believe that maybe the effort was kind of, worth it, right? It's usually rare to get through. Usually, human activities are normally calibrated on kind of, let's say, of humanly sized expectations. Like you don't expect really to do something that is beyond evidently your limits, but it's rare to find in activities in which you say, well, this was not worth it. Where probably war is the one into which this is kind of more recognizable. So because it's obvious that that there are certain wars that are so costly that can mess seriously up everything afterwards, just as much as there were wars that showed that theoretically could go well, and of which you could even foretaste the in some certain conditions the outcome, the advantages of the outcome, right? But in just to make the example of normal things that happen, that's how radically also in here the perception can be extended in the sense not just to the people who went through the thing, but of people who look at the thing and think on how much this is important in understanding military history. Like, it's the usual story, of maybe not of the winner that writes history, because by the way, it's not really true. I mean, it's not really true that winners write history, or that they necessarily write it to just speak bad of the defeated. Like, it's a pretty unfair assessment to history in itself. It's obvious that there is something like that. Also, probably it's prevalent. It happens most of the times, but history usually gets explored, and society changes and sides fade. So the thing is way more shaded than that. So don't buy that cliche necessarily either, but also be always aware of how the subjective perspective of history has to do with how we judge history. Unfortunately, we live in a time in which we presume that, as I was saying before, there is a kind of a orthodox historical awareness or understanding, or even evidence, right? And I believe that every, let's say, serious or conscientious, my English really sucks, historian is capable of, I mean, it is all about trying to figure out what the method, what the approach to history should really be about. I mean, seriously, that's how can we interpret this historical event? That's the first thing you should, I mean, not really to find a narrative and then an agenda and so on, but to really say, but is what I'm basing my opinion on in the first place real? This is not really much about the honesty of intentions, because as we were saying before, we're all biased in a certain way. But it's really the problem of saying, even if I am, I have a narrative or something, on which base can I presume myself to know what I'm talking about, and therefore to go out there to probably also have someone criticizing me, because especially if I have an agenda that can be dramatically evident. That's why you should always tend towards objectivity and not towards subjectivity, as a general rule. Otherwise, we transform ourselves in politicians, not in historians, right? So aside from this, it's very meaningful after a victory or a defeat, what kind of reaction or impression there is from that defeat, what kind of scapegoats, what kind of reasons, justifications, whatever we employ to tell that story. And you'll find this enormously interesting because it's able to influence the narrative of the same events, in the way they're told, right? And this is particularly important because probably, and that's also another way you can challenge the perspective of that history is written by winners. History is written by winners. Sometimes it's also written by losers. Sometimes it's even written by winners and losers together. I mean, let's be honest about this. And that can be even worse, because it can really derail from honesty, from reason, in many ways, especially exploiting this emotional tide that naturally, not tide, how you say in English, well, whatever, but this wave of emotions that naturally is attached to the struggles and the difficulties and the sufferings in war. So every time you read about a victory or a defeat, always try to perceive what that particular evidence could have been written like, right? Today, for example, I was studying a battle. I'm trying to reconstruct a battle, not for Schwerpunkt, really, for my own business. And I have lots of sources, right? Some from the side of the defeated, some from the side of the winners, and it's so you may expect, if you're not really into this stuff, if you don't work with sources, you just read history like this, simply how many intersections and, let's say, how much true and how much false you can find in both perspectives. Like, it's never that simple to say, the winner is just saying, but this is something maybe you can find on YouTube comments on average. Like, fortunately on Schwerpunkt it doesn't quite happen, but if you go take a look at every average video about, I don't know, national anthems or some etc., there is under the comments, just go take a look in there, how the polarization of comments there are, and at that point you can identify polarization in the lack of, fundamentally, in ignorance, right? Because they don't know what you're talking about, and then when you find someone that comes there to say something slightly more meaningful, it's very interesting to see also in there what's the motive, sorry, and how that is arranged, and it's, I mean, obviously YouTube comments really suck in general. So, as a regular, on average, I must say your comments on Schwerpunkt are dramatically higher in quality to the average, something which I'm happy. But that naturally you should be able to do this, not really on YouTube but on actual history books, and saying, why is this person writing this, and why is it that this interpretation has been adopted? Because we all have this different attitudes compared to relatively to this to any given topic. So what von Clausewitz is really saying here, to conclude, is that when you win, you tend to minimize the memory of bad things. This happens over time in general, right? That there were moments that sucked in the past, but then we tend to remove the bad sides of the story, and to think of moments that we would have gladly skipped as, I have now nostalgia about that. Well, when you lose, well, instead that's serious, that you that opens you to, I believe, a much deeper reflection on the causes of the defeat, and that, in my opinion, this last one is, I mean, the first one is a kind of more propositive and sometimes even more optimistic ideal, because it means that in some way we do work well, that even our irrational side is calibrated on the base of certain kind of progress. That is, you forget bad things to live better in a future, and to do better in general for yourself. When you lose, though, I think it's way more interesting, because at the same time you'll be scarred by one another, but you're still, so you can't even take it badly or wrongly and making wrong things, but at the same time, that's, at least as a case of observation, it's way more, it's way deeper, it's way more fascinating, and should always be taken into consideration. We should have much more interest for losers than for winners, to see how people cope with difficulties, because I believe that that's what we can learn the most from. And in general, if you talk about war, that's even more evident. Because what's better? Like, think about, well, let's not make a specific example, because otherwise we can't even get political at that point, but, think of a power that, aside from its own convictions or whatever, is defeated, right? Probably had a motive, he had causes why it got to that point, why it got into war in the first place, can be, active initiative or passive, reaction to an aggression. It can be whatever. So it can be from every side. It doesn't matter. It does matter after the defeat how you can think of the future at the end of the day, because that's what we are interested in. Because if they wanted to suicide in themselves, we would say, oh wow, well, that's gone, end of the story. It did happen, by the way, but as long as this part is not wiped away, wiped out, they probably have their own narrative to explain something, right? And at that point, society did change, right? Being defeated into a war is not something that comes without a cost, obviously, but this cost is going to be reflected chiefly on the defeated. So at that point, the defeated has, the task of finding a way that was in a condition that was not really desirable at the beginning. So something that puts them in the condition of rethinking certain aspects of their culture, whatever, right? So this could, at this point, I'm probably not very interested to be listened. Like I'm just thinking about something else and clicking on our stuff. But I hope at least the concept was clear. Like how important it is to evaluate the subjectivity in an objective fashion. Not to erase subjectivity, but to accept that it's our subjectivity that makes us need to be objective, and that we can't really do it so easily, meaning that at the end of the day, our objectivity is required in the measure of which rationality is required. It is usually required to solve problems, right? So that's why the winner sometimes is a loser in some ways as well, because it overlooks its power. So you should never loosen the guard, and that's why you should always be there trying to think and not to surrender to the Übers of the winner, right? And instead, that's what it's often done, and that's where the greatest disasters stop. Reading Vom Clausewitz would be so useful for having a healthier society. Like a society that looks at real problems, not fake problems. A society that takes into consideration objectivity and subjectivity in a correct fashion. It's something you don't have anymore. It seems we are regressing to that. And part of the reason, you know why? Because we are winners. Because we have stopped struggling. So that's why this happens. That's why we are losing that ability of understanding at various levels, of speaking without thinking, of really picking sides that are really worthless, and to support ideas that are really stupid or that they do not work. We have stopped challenging ourselves. And you can't stop challenging yourself. Otherwise, what would be life worth for, right? And there would be many other further considerations about this, but maybe for now we stop. Just bear in mind that Von Clausewitz is really this clear, this sometimes simple, because let's be honest, Von Clausewitz is not easy, but it's simple, right? If you follow him step by step, there is really not a big effort you have to do to understand anyway. It's more your own, in fact, subjective side of the story that gets challenged at that point. So if you have prejudices and you pretend to interpret, for example, Von Clausewitz on the basis of these prejudices, at that point it's not a matter of Von Clausewitz that you don't understand. You probably don't understand most of very interesting things. Secondly, I would say there is, let's say, if you're open-minded instead enough to accept to be challenged, because that's really the greatest challenge in turn that we have, proving that we can access a higher perspective if we can read him, and always be aware that he's always working. Like von Clausewitz never fails you. That's one of the things that it's you can always count on von Clausewitz. It may seem strange to say, but it is really so. I can hardly think of an equivalent. Like maybe a book of physics could also never fail me, and it's not a surprise that von Clausewitz is so interested in science, and yet so conscious about the peculiar side of human nature that in some ways doesn't really elude the scientific dimension, but is exactly in biological terms extremely complex, right? You can argue that the complexity of war stands within the complexity of mankind. I mean, war is not an external thing. War is within us. Sadly or luckily, we don't know, or both of them, because at the end of the day, we are who we are because we are defined by this inner conflictuality, and it's dramatic, just like life is dramatic in general. I could go on, but let's stop it here for now. So next time we will be reading instead the chapter 6, of course, that is titled Information in War. So also in here we go on very interesting grounds once again. These are kind of smaller chapters, as you have understood now, than the third one we have seen. We've concluded some days ago, but they're equally important, and they're tiny little pearls of wisdom that you have always to bear in mind. Remember, you can't read von Clausewitz if you think you can cherry pick whatever you like. It's a broad system that works because of all these elements, and and the more you progress, and the more you have to bear in mind. That is a challenge in itself as well, but it's also how you can really master this, and you can, master maybe not, because that would equate to master von Clausewitz, but let's say you can really rise at his own levels, or approach at least to them, and to really make your life easier. Because I believe at the end of the day, this is what von Clausewitz really shows you. This is not really about war, this is about life in general, I presume. But whatever. So for now, I just thank you for listening to me, and if you're interested, I usually I forget my last line. What I usually say is, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.